Good morning, everybody. Hold on just one second. I have to take care of something. It looks like there's a deer outside my window. It's a deer in the headlights. No, excuse me. That's just the Republican Party this morning. Wow, did we get wiped out last night in the state of Wisconsin. Progressive, radical circuit court judge in Dane County, Susan Crawford, wins the Supreme Court race by a whopping 55.1% to 44.9% margin. Incumbent Jill Underly, another progressive radical, won a closer 53 to 47% race over Brittany Kinzer. And so this morning, I think anybody who has been trying to argue that we are some kind of still reddish, purplish state can throw that argument in the trash can. We are back to blue, and it's a very convincing deep blue, if you ask me. Republicans going into this race knew they had to have, let me back up, everybody who voted in this race, and there were 2.3 million people, a record turnout, knew the stakes. Everybody going into those voting booths knows exactly what the Supreme Court is going to do now. They're probably likely going to rule school choice, which has been a staple program here since the days of Tommy Thompson, which has helped so many minority kids in Milwaukee. They're likely going to rule that unconstitutional. Act 10 is just stone cold dead. That prohibits most collective bargaining by public sector employees. The teachers' union is going to be back, and so are higher property taxes, and so is ironclad union control of the classrooms. Everybody knew this. There was too much money spent in this race, too much advertising going on not to know it. The people who went out and voted that way because they knew what was going to happen. Now, Republicans had gone into this race hoping that with some positivity in the closing days, because there was such a surge in early voting, particularly in red areas of the state, typically Waukesha County, for instance. I think the early voting total was triple what it had been in the past. That was a pattern that happened throughout the race. Of course, the question was, is this going to really reflect a higher turnout, voter turnout, or is this just going to cannibalize the Tuesday election vote? Nobody knew, but what Republicans knew for a fact, that the vote total had to be a lot larger than it was 2 years ago when progressive Janet Protasewicz beat Dan Kelly for the Supreme Court. That was 1.85 million votes, so they knew it had to be a lot larger. Well, a lot larger it was. It turned out that it really was a higher turnout. It was a record turnout. 2.33 million people cast ballots in the election, and yet the bad news for Republicans is the margin was just about the same. Protasewicz won a 10 or 11-point victory, and the same margin yesterday. So what's going on here? Well, of course, the national press and even the state press is going to come out and say, and as they were pitching this before the election, oh, this is a referendum on Elon Musk, this is a referendum on Donald Trump. I think that's far too shallow an answer. You have to put it in the context of all that's been going on in statewide elections in the state of Wisconsin since 2016, and I'll address that in a second. But let's start with the Supreme Court and this particular race. And we now have seen Protasewicz win 2 years ago. Susan Crawford wins last night. Then you had Rebecca Dallett and Jill Karofsky win. You had 4 progressive Democrat candidates win Supreme Court seats to give the progressives who a majority that they will now have until at least 2028. Supreme Court races, to counter the narrative that's been going on in the national media, Supreme Court races are a little different animal, even in the context of how partisan they have become. They're technically nonpartisan, but they are partisan, of course. There's two things that stand out. First of all, they take place in the spring, and that is a turnout election. So that tends to favor the Democrats. When I was growing up, of course, low turnout elections favored Republicans. Wealthy, affluent Republicans always went out to vote. Working class, poor Democrats weren't as engaged in the political process and voted in lower total numbers. That was the standard. The standard's kind of reversed today. Lower turnout elections help Democrats. They've become the party of the more affluent suburbs, the more affluent professionals. They go out and vote. As the Republican Party has become more working class, its vote totals, its turnout numbers are shakier at best, to say it that way. Now, whether that was the case yesterday is hard to say. It is worth pointing out that in last November's election, when Donald Trump eked out a 30,000 vote victory, there were 3.3 to 3.4 million votes cast. There was about 1.1 million less votes yesterday. So you see how big the turnout can make a difference in a small spring election. And you're running a very highly partisan race in what is supposedly a nonpartisan lower turnout election. The Democrats have a built-in advantage. That said, we can also say that given that the margins were the same, the vote turnout did increase from 1.85 to 2.33, and the margin was the same. So whether if having 3.4 million people vote would have made a difference is certainly arguable. But there's another aspect to these Supreme Court races that have to be taken into consideration, and that is that very what has become the partisan nature of it. The Democrats in particular, over the last several elections, and particularly with Protasiewicz and Crawford, they campaign like they're campaigning for governor. And in a way, they are running for governor. They're running to run the government. They're going to legislate from the bench. They're going to be the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch all rolled into one. And they make no bones about it. Act 10 is unconstitutional. The 1849 abortion ban is unconstitutional. They say what they think. And Republicans in these races have taken a more ethical and what they're supposed to do approach, which is a more nonpartisan approach, and they stress the rule of law. They're not going to say how they're going to vote on any particular case. In general, we know how they think, but that's a very big difference in the way you campaign. And when you're campaigning like you're at a presidential rally or running for governor, you motivate people in a way that you don't motivate people when you are running as you should be, as running for the justice to sit on the state Supreme Court. I think that makes a big difference, and it puts Republicans at a disadvantage. So I think the nature of the race has to be considered. But now let's move to the broader picture. And the broader picture is Republicans have just been taking a shellacking in these statewide races. Let's break down some of these races as we look since 2016. Okay, let's look governor. We saw Evers win in 2018. Evers win again in 2022 against Tim Michels, a very weak candidate. U.S. Senate, we see Tammy Baldwin dispatch Leah Vukmir in 2018, and again dispatching Eric Hovde in last year, 2024, the same year Trump wins in the state. We have Attorney General Josh Kaul winning 2 elections and beating Republicans. We have the 4 Supreme Court justices winning. You add it all up, and it's massive and Democratic victories across the board. The only exceptions to that are Donald Trump, 2016, Donald Trump, 2024, and he lost by 20,000 votes in 2020. If election officials had upheld the election law of the state, he probably would have won that. The other exception, of course, is Senator Ron Johnson. Now, this leads me to what I'm talking about in terms of analysis of what's going on here. We have a Republican Party that is hemorrhaging voters. Now, the popular line is to look at the so-called WOW counties. That's Waukesha, and that's Ozaukee, and that's Washington counties. And they just came in, these suburbs of Milwaukee, these suburban counties around Milwaukee would come in with just these massive Republican numbers offsetting Dane County, Milwaukee County, a lot of it, and putting Republicans in a position to win for years and years and years. And that is no longer the case. If we look at Waukesha last night, and Brad Schimel is from Waukesha, Schimel won with only 57.7% of the vote. If we look at Ozaukee, it's even worse, 51.6% of the vote Brad Schimel got. Only Washington County stood strong in red at 66% of the vote. So the WOW counties are no longer wowing. The erosion, of course, is happening. This is not just a phenomenon among Republicans in Wisconsin, but suburban voters have moved to the Democratic Party, particularly women suburban voters, for some time now. But we're also seeing in more rural areas an erosion of Republican conservative votes, and it's something the Republican Party should be very concerned about. If you look at northern Wisconsin last night, Oneida County often for years and years would come in at around 60% plus for Republicans. Last night, Brad Schimel got 54.4% of the vote. If you look at Vilas County, I always remember Vilas County was one of the most rock-ribbed Republican counties of the North, reliably getting 65% of the vote. Last night, it was 58.9% of the vote. So we have this erosion, we have this realignment where naturally these suburban voters have moved into the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has become more working class. But there seems to be a reluctance to move to the Republican Party. There seems to be a movement away from the Republican Party. And I would posit to you this morning that the Republicans need to wake up and take a look at it. And that is that we are not, contrary to the narrative that you're going to hear in the media, we're not sufficiently pro-Trump. And if you want to take him out of the equation, we're not sufficiently pro-MAGA, and we're not sufficiently pro-Maha. Look at the candidates, again, I just pointed this out, but look at the candidates who have won elections in Wisconsin during this Democratic sweep. It's Trump 2 times out of 3, and it's Ron Johnson, and boy, did the Democrats want to get rid of Ron Johnson. He beat Feingold, and he won again last time. So Ron Johnson, and let me tell you about Ron Johnson. Trump speaks for himself, but let me tell you about Ron Johnson. When he first ran for the Senate, and he sat down in the Lakeland Times, and we interviewed him, and afterwards we said, boy, that is a lousy Senate candidate. That is perhaps the most arrogant establishment Republican we have ever interviewed. And I wasn't sure he'd be elected, but when he was, and then you watch over the years, particularly since 2020, Ron Johnson has transformed. He's become perhaps the best, certainly one of the best United States senators of all. He has been relentless in pursuing the misdeeds of Anthony Fauci, opposing the pandemic lockdowns and misinformation. He has done a great service in standing up for the vaccine injured. He has become a front-line stand-up senator for the MAGA Maha movement. And he is the one that survived all around as Republicans in Wisconsin were falling, him and Donald Trump. So I would suggest that there's a couple of things going on, that voters don't trust the Republican Party, but if they get the right candidates, and if the Republican Party in the state becomes less establishment as it's been centered in southeastern Wisconsin, then it will do quite well for itself. The Republican Party has some sins it's carrying on its shoulders. One sin is that it completely ignores the rest of the state while it has pushed corporate big business subsidies into southeastern Wisconsin for their special interest friends. namely Foxconn is the shining poster child for such subsidies. The Republican Party leadership in the legislature has continued that. They voted for Fiserv, hundreds of millions of tax dollars going to a private stadium. And right now in the legislature, we have the establishment Republican Party standing up for right of first refusal. I hope it doesn't pass, but standing up for right of first refusal, which is giving incumbent utilities in this state a monopoly. And we actually had, I may have mentioned this on a previous podcast, we actually had one Republican representative, Karen Hurd, whoever she is, testify that utilities, they're a natural monopoly. And capitalism, it doesn't always work. And we give these monopolies, and monopolies will raise prices, but it won't happen here because we will heavily regulate it. Now, when you get Republicans talking like that, you can see why we have a problem in the state of Wisconsin. We need to get on the bandwagon, or we're going to lose. Not only will we continue to lose the governorship in 2026, we'll lose the assembly and the state senate as well. So bottom line here today from me is that this is a clarion call, a wake-up call for the grassroots MAGA Maha movement to assert itself in its rightful ascendancy in the state Republican Party. And the nation needs to know that the false narrative that this was a referendum on Trump is just plain false. I hope everybody has a great day. We'll try to as we dig ourselves out of the rubble. I'm Richard Moore, and this is the American Investigator Newsroom.